Hello and welcome to HMCS Sackville and the Flower class. Now I'm going to start off this video a little bit differently than I normally do. I'm going to start off with you getting to look at Sackville for roughly a minute without me saying anything. I just want you to enjoy looking at her in her preserved state and imagine what it used to look like in Halifax Harbour with literally dozens and dozens of Flower class corvettes going in and out, readying for their escorts, readying for their convoys, refitting, going around their minesweeping duties, their oceanography duties, all the other things they were doing and called upon. And just imagine how many of them used to fill up the harbour along with the merchant ships they were protecting. Now, wasn't she beautiful? Sackville is one of 294 Flower class corvettes. Now, the majority of these vessels were the original, 225 of them, but they did produce roughly 69 modified vessels. There were only 11 vessels cancelled of the entire run, and during World War II they served the Royal Navy, of course, the Royal Canadian Navy, the United States Navy, the Free French Navy, the Free Belgian, the Royal Hellenic Navy, the Royal Indian Navy, the Royal Netherlands Navy, the Royal New Zealand Navy, the Royal Norwegian Navy, the South African Navy, the Royal Yugoslavian Navy, and the Kriegsmarine. Honestly, I think the Regia Marina and the Imperial Japanese Navy were probably feeling a bit left out. I'm wondering why they feel so spurned by this particular class. And what were they for? Well, they were sub-hunters. That is literally what the corvettes are. They build, as mentioned, 294. 294. 33 vessels are lost in World War II, 22 to submarines. They take out a lot more submarines than submarines get Flower class corvettes. Mainly because there is a whole problem for a submarine with engaging a Flower class corvette, and we're going to be getting into this as we go through their story. Because a Flower class corvette is not what a submarine wants to kill. They're not. The Flower class corvette is something the submarine wants to avoid. It wants to kill the merchant ships. The many, many thousand-ton merchant ships, not the 1,000-ton, very quick, very easy to reproduce escort. If they have to use a torpedo to sink a Flower class corvette, that's a torpedo they cannot use to sink a merchant ship. And the odds are you don't just fire one torpedo to get that hit. You're probably firing a spread of 2, 3, or 4. So you've used those torpedoes. If you want to get into a surface fight with a corvette, they'll love that. The surface is where they're king. They have the big 4-inch gun. They have the pom-poms and the other guns that can pepper you full of holes. And guess what? They're supposed to stay afloat. They're designed to stay afloat. You're designed to sink as a U-boat. It's not good if you get more holes in you. So you might win the fight, but you've lost the war because you are now out of it, and there'll be another Flower class corvette coming along in a second to remind you that you just upset it by taking out its friend. This is the reality of fighting the Flower class. They're going to come for you, and they're going to take you out. And they're going to keep on coming. The Flagg-class corvettes, though, have a long history behind them. This is a calculation which the Royal Navy understood well. The idea of the cheap but cheerful, cheerfully crude, mass-produced escort goes hand in hand with the convoy. One of the things you often get when you're talking about naval warfare is that naval strategy is a procurement strategy. What you procure is what gives you the capabilities and options. Convoys are not able to be done by navies which are just procuring high-value vessels. They'll never have enough of them to be able to protect enough convoys. You cannot protect a convoy formation and convoys unless you're building a large number of cheap vessels. Vessels which have enough capability to get the job done, no more, no less. And that is the secret to the Flagg-class success. They had enough capability to get the job done. They didn't need any more. They might have liked it. They didn't get it. But they had enough. And that's what the Flagg-class are for. They're for being enough. Being an escort. Being the capability which gets the convoy through. War is often a mixture of the abstract and the personal. The abstract is the ships, like sheepdogs circling their herd of seemingly languorous merchant vessels in the vast of the Atlantic's expanse. For those aboard the ships that Nicholas Montserrat famously described in The Cruel Sea as being 200 feet long, broad, chunky, graceless, designed purely for anti-submarine work and not much more than a floating platform for depth charges. She was the prototype of a class of ship which could be produced quickly and cheaply in the future to meet the urgent demands of convoy escort. The experience of the personnel probably belied the fact that these were not ships that had been produced quickly. The Flagg-class, in fact, had a long and involved process which created them, starting with another Flagg-class. Now, this story begins back with these. The Flagg-class, in fact, well, the sloops of World War I Flagg-class were a true crash build program. These were not started prior to World War I. They were started during it. The Flagg-class corvettes of World War II have a process which starts, well, can be traced back as early as 1935 if you really want to push it, in terms of that individual class, and the process which has developed them has gone back even further, right to these vessels of World War I. These were a true crash build program ordered in 1915, when war is well and truly underway. 1,200 tons, 262 feet long ships capable of 17 knots. They were created as an Admiralty solution for a government which was up against the wall by the submarine warfare that was being waged on them. And it's important to realise there is often a strange discussion when it comes to the Flagg-class as to whether or not they're produced to be oceanic vessels. They use an oceanic hull for their design, all sorts of things. People discuss, are they actually, supposed to be ocean ships, or are they coastal works? Well, if Norway doesn't fall, and if France doesn't fall, the British perception of any submarine war is it's going to be much like the submarine war was in World War I, where you have to patrol a blockade of mines and etc. across the channel to stop German submarines going out that way. And so German submarines are going to be quite limited in their area they can attack, because they're going to have to go up, chart a course between Norway and the UK, trying to avoid patrolling aircraft, go out into the North Atlantic, and the convoys are going to be coming up into Western Approaches Command, which means, again, they're going to be coming up to the southwest of the UK, because all the Britain will just make sure all the convoys are coming up from as far away from the German angle attack as possible. Under those scenarios, the Flagg-class corvettes were going to be deployed in small escort groups which would pick up convoys at the extent of the range of the German submarines, and then protect them and marshal them in the approaches to the ports, and do the coastal work as well. They were still supposed to be ocean capable, because this is going to sound strange. The North Sea is not exactly a nice place. The Atlantic Ocean is not a nice place. The Irish Sea is not a nice place. These are bodies of water which are not nice places to be ships. On roughly, I would say, if I was doing it off the top of my head, roughly 260 days of the year, they are actively trying to take out any ships on them. Every other day of the year, so the remaining roughly 100 and something days of the year, 105 days of the year, they are going pell-mell with everything they can to take out everything on them, and small islands. These are not bodies of water where you are going to take a ship which is not designed to deal with large waves, large problems, and the ocean really throwing everything it has at you and everything it can find to throw at you on. These are not oceans which can be treated with anything less than the absolute greatest respect. And you cannot send a ship which is not really designed for dealing with big waves out into them in any way, shape or form. Not if you want to get it back. And not if you want it to actually accomplish its task or get its crew back. Now, the problem is, the Acacia class, the Azalea class, the Arabis class, the Orberita, the Orberita class, the Anchusa class, I should get my mum in to pronounce these because she's far better with flower names than I ever will be, were all actually slightly bigger, as you can guess, than their more famous World War II successors. They're bigger even than the modified Flowers or the Castle class which succeed the Flowers. There is a reason they can be afforded to be the size, and there is a reason they are that size. One of the cruel things of fate is that the Royal Navy in World War I has a far larger maritime industry to call upon than it does in World War II. Partially because of that whole naval arms race which has been sweeping up the entire world, but also because of the revolution in engineering that's been going on in shipping, which has led to a lot of merchant ship construction. And Britain, which was at the forefront of the developments of the enhanced triple expansion engine, of the turbine, of a lot of the marine diesel work actually, has all been done through British yards and implemented through British yards, has really benefited from this and grown. Now, the question I often get put from people go, oh, well, the Royal Navy built small ships in World War One, then they forgot about them, and then they had to crash build them again in World War Two, which shows they didn't care about these things. They did. They did keep building them. Even under treaties, they built these interwar sloops. And the trouble is, though, in the 1920s, you have a treasury which is very much trying to claw back money. Now, there is often a discussion on this which basically goes, Britain is broke after World War One. It's not. It's got a large amount of debt. But if we are going to deal with the fact that the countries today have a huge amount of debt from various things which have taken place recently, and yet we still do not describe them as broke, and they are still functioning, and they are still investing in huge expensive projects because that's what their governments decide they need to do, you cannot then go back and describe Britain after World War One as broke. Britain after World War Two, after the joys of the World War One, the economic eras of the 1920s and 30s, and World War Two, that is Britain which is broke. After World War Two. After World War One, they're merely deciding to pay off their debt quickly, and they're trying to pay it off as quickly as they can. They're paying it off as quickly as they can. They don't need to pay it off as quickly as they are, but they're making the choice. So that's a priority of government spending. There's also a priority of government spending in that they are trying to start off the beginnings of the welfare state. There are the beginnings of things which are land fit for heroes phraseology starting to appear. It doesn't reach the level of universal healthcare, all those sort of things, but it is starting to grow. And finally, you have a government which is sufficiently wrapped up in the ideology of being laissez-faire, that when a recession hits, instead of doing what would probably be a sensible mass order of sloops, which they were building, they were sort of a case of going, oh, well, yes, but if they fail, that's because they're not good and they're not efficient enough. They're not good enough industry. But also, there's the strategic thing that if you let these companies fail, you don't have them to call upon them when you need them in World War II. So in World War One, you can build a larger sloop, a more military, well, more naval design than mercantile design. In World War II, to get the numbers, you're having to build a mercantile build, far more mercantile build than you built in World War One, and you've got less yards really to do it, so to get the same pace of production, you're going to have to go with a simpler, smaller design. There's also the other thing that's carrying on, and that's another reason why the Royal Navy isn't building small ships. Because they built literally oodles and oodles of these things, and they were still serving. They still worked. They hadn't been used that badly, they hadn't been damaged that much, and they were still around. In fact, some of the vessels, Chrysanthemum, which was finally scrapped in 1995, Saxifrage, currently being restored to museum condition, otherwise known as President at times in its life, continued to be out of service on more drill ships, not only throughout World War II, but well into the 20th century. Almost to the end of the 20th century. They were around for a long time. There are, though, two problems when it comes to building sloops, when it comes to building forces. It's getting the technology right. So the Royal Navy does keep building sloops. They are especially considerate of building vessels which fit in that unique Article 8 bracket of the Washington Naval Treaty. Now, this specifies that they have to be a naval service combatants of 600 tons, standard displacement under, naval service combatants exceeding 600 tons but not exceeding 2,000 tons, standard displacement, provided they have none of the following characteristics, and this is the criteria sloops fit into. Mount a gun above 6.1 inches caliber, mount more than 4 guns above 3 inches caliber, are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots. Those vessels were not limited in terms of the number they could build. But again, if you already have a stock of older vessels which are doing the role, you don't build a lot of them. Now, you should. Please note, I am a firm believer in some of the admirals, etc.'s case they put forward that they wanted to match build from 1930 onwards. For every flotilla of destroyers they built, they wanted to build a flotilla of sloops to deal with anti-submarine warfare threat. And there were quite a large number of naval personnel who were behind that. But the Treasury turned around and went, well, these are destroyer-sized vessels, so obviously you can choose whether you build them or destroyers, because they obviously fill the same role. And they don't. They don't have torpedoes, they can't do fleet work, so if you've got the choice of you can either order destroyers or sloops, what are you going to order? Destroyers. You should be ordering both. And you can understand the Treasury to an extent. They want to keep a firm handle on British expenses and try and make sure the government isn't spending more money than it's got coming in through taxation and other financial means. But still, there is, to an extent, they are saving pennies at the expense of pounds. Now, these vessels, the interwar sloops, were a constant process of construction. They first commissioned in 1928 the Bridgewater class, which displaced 1,045 tons. There followed in 1930 by the Hastings, also 1,045 tons. Then the Shoreham class, 1,105 tons. Followed by the Grimsby class, 1,006 tons. Then they tried to see how small a vessel they could build and still make it navally useful. They tried the Kingfisher class. 518 to 589 tons, depending on individual member of the class. Then they went to the Bittern class, 1,190 tons, the Egret class, 1,200 tons, and of course, most famous of all, the Black Swans, 1,250 tons. The Bittern class are really worthy of looking at and really should be more famous than they are, because they provided the hull for the Hunt class escort destroyer, as well as the hull design for the Egrets and the Black Swans. They also provided the template for those vessels. And their anti-submarine warfare fit and their general design and ideas behind that were actually the fit which was used as, this is the fit we've got to find a vessel to fit in. So when the Royal Navy, when the 3rd Sea Lord, etc. are looking around for a vessel that can do anti-submarine warfare, they're looking for a vessel which can fit the anti-submarine warfare fit of a Bittern class, as it's projected to have in its anti-submarine warfare role. Please note, that's not necessarily the fit it's actually launched with. Why? Because sloops are used for a massive amount of different duties. They are in peacetime the little post ships, present ships wandering into small ports. They are extra vessels on the Far East where they go around with guns, and basically what we might sometimes call a gunboat was actually a sloop. Just it was carrying its guns and nothing else, and that's what it's being used as, because it's a small, cheap ship that can be used for that role. They'd often be used for anti-submarine warfare training, but also mine laying, mine recovery, torpedo recovery and exercises. They had all sorts of duties, which meant that necessarily going around with their normal ASW fit, or proposed ASW fit from the beginning, was not really something they were going to do. And these are the decision makers you have at the top. Yes, you have lots of people. You have an entire teams working underneath them. And you can start naming all of them, but these are the ones who set the tone for the Royal Navy's procurement in this period for everything. There's even an interesting discussion over the King George V class battleships. But leaving that to one side, Reginald Henson, Vice Admiral, 3rd Sea Lord, that is the person in charge of procurement of the Royal Navy's ships, and all the systems and supplies which support them from 1933 onwards. And Stanley Goodall. He's the Director of Naval Construction, the Royal Navy's Chief Architect. He's the one who's got to make sure everything works and fits. This one comes up with the ideas, keeps the people going, generally provides leadership. This is the one that makes that leadership work. If we were thinking about them in modern discussions of modern personnel in a government, well, that's your Chief Executive Officer, and this is your Chief Operating Officer. CEO, coup. That is their roles. Everything technical has to be passed and checked, no matter how small. It will have his signature on. It has to. He's the Director of Naval Construction. The buck stops with him. If a design goes through, and this has actually brought down naval constructors in the past, they have let a royal yacht be designed by a subordinate, and then it's been terrible. They've lost their job because of that. Because the buck stops with you. You are the professional head of the constructors. You have to assess the work. It puts an enormous amount of pressure on them. Enormous amount. But they are often there at the end of a very long career, and they know what works. Interesting enough, constructors are also not often that sort of regressively conservative. We're not going to do anything risky unless that makes us look bad. No, they're often push for innovative solutions. But they do always push for a lot of testing and a lot of thought before a decision gets made. Namely because that tends to protect them from fallback, if they can say they've properly tested it. Wave tanks, in even airflow testing occasionally. in wind tunnels. You do what you need to do to make sure testing is done as thoroughly as possible. Between these two leaders, the Royal Navy developed in the 1930s, and they had to make a lot of decisions about design. And they were making a lot of decisions about what actually needed to be in any vessel. Because you see, what would happen is a department would come in, and let's say it's the Technical Department for Anti-Submarine Warfare. That's not actually named department, but there is a department which has that responsibility, but they have various other things included in it. And let's say they're that. And let's say they come forward and they go, right then, well, any future ship has got to have 200 depth charges on it. And these would look at these two leaders would look at them and go, 200. We're designing a vessel which has got 1,000-ton standard displacement. Where are we going to fit 200 depth charges? Well, that's what we need. And then the person for anti-aircraft warfare would come and go, oh, we've got to have 3 4-inch guns, 6 4-inch guns, 12 4-inch guns, and 40mm, 12 of them. Okay. So you want to fit 12 4-inch guns, 12 40mm, 12 pom-poms, and 200 depth charges. No, don't worry about the 200 depth charges. You need the air defense. And then another department comes in and goes, oh, you need this. And it goes on. And it might be their teams will take a decision, will then put together a design, and will send it up to them. They'll look at it. They agree with design. They then take it off to the meeting of the Lords of the Admiralty. And in Lords of the Admiralty, you have the First Sea Lord, etc., all try and make their case for whatever they believe of the group should actually be taking precedence and should actually have more given to it. And these, the Third Sea Lord and Director of Naval Construction, especially the Third Sea Lord, have to defend the compromise and decisions they made. They have to make a lot of valuation and value judgments and calls based usually on this person's experience. This person's design knowledge, and this person's experience. And the Royal Navy was peculiarly lucky because Reginald Henderson had a huge amount of experience when it came to convoy warfare. He was the person who came up with the convoy system and really wrote the report for the convoy system in World War I. At Jellicoe's instructions, he goes and does the report. He's picked to go and do the report. One of Jellicoe's protégés. With his report, because Jellicoe already knew the value of convoys. This is one of the things that's often forgotten about Jellicoe. People think he's very anti-convoy. No, he's having to deal with a very senior admiralty who a larger number of whom are anti-convoy. Because it's going to strip the ground fleet of escorts and this sort of that and the other thing. And to an extent, Beatty is really at the head of that group. Because he thinks losing the escorts is going to limit his freedom of movement with the ground fleet. And he's worried about that from the point of view of fighting the Germans if they come out again. We know history, they don't come out again after Jutland, but well, they do come out, but not out ever as much or ever as great a force as they had before. We know that. They don't. So you can, to an extent, understand their judgment and their discussion going on. But Jellicoe has to make the case. But Jellicoe, remember, had organised convoys himself to get his coal up to Scapa Flow. That's how Jellicoe had got his coal supplies to be reliable for the Grand Fleet, by organising them into convoys and escorting those convoys. i.e., Jellicoe is not a moron. He does realise these things. He just needs a good report written to justify it. He calls up a young officer, Reginald Henderson. And he gets the report written. Henderson goes on through quite a good career to become the first ever Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. So, remember that next time someone says the Royal Navy is approaching World War II, is full of hidebound admirals who do not understand naval aviation do not understand the role of carriers, and it's because they're not doing it this way or that way. Remember, the person in charge of procurement for the Royal Navy leading into World War II was an officer who had written several papers on submarine warfare explaining exactly how they could strangle Britain, had written the paper justifying convoys, had commanded at several battles and been a critical officer in ships at several battles in World War I, and was the first ever Rear Admiral aircraft carriers for the Royal Navy, who had written 90% of the carrier doctrine that we were using in run-up to developing the Royal Navy World War II, and the Royal Navy doctrine that then is used for Taranto, for Mers el-Kabir, for all those scenarios. The initial doctrine is his. And he's the one in charge of procuring the Royal Navy. He's the one making decisions. And remember, he's the one who makes the judgment calls. You can have officers sitting off in all sorts of places, and the Royal Navy, which has so many admirals it does, is going to have officers spouting off in all sorts of places. What matters is the officers who are making the decisions, not the officers who are spouting off at some random posting who have no bearing on it. There are some very interesting papers in the National Archives of people, including persons like Admiral Cunningham, when he's Rear Admiral destroyers in the Mediterranean, etc., writing all sorts of papers to Henderson about this, that, and you should be doing this, and Henderson just going, I don't agree with you. And thank God for Cunningham, Henderson didn't agree with him, because otherwise the tribal class destroyers and all the larger destroyers of the Royal Navy for World War II would not have been built, because Cunningham was absolutely dead set against them. And then in World War II, he becomes their biggest proponent when he starts using them. It's one of those things. The guy who's the Rear Admiral destroyers in the 1930s of the Mediterranean Fleet is really against big destroyers because he doesn't see their purpose, he doesn't see their role. No, we just need lots of small destroyers launching lots of torpedoes. And then World War II comes around and it's, oh, sugar, we need general purpose destroyers. Oh, thank God we got the bigger destroyers which are capable of being general purpose. So these are the two which really matter. I would normally say the first Sea Lord matters, but Chatfield is an interesting scenario. Now, in the modern world, submarines are thought of as hunters. And it's something which has come about as their range of operation, speed and movement has grown, and it's not really reflective of where they started off. Where they started, they were defensive tools, ambush predators, capable of deterring attacks on a nation in theory, or robbing attacks of momentum. They were mobile minefields, in effect. But they had very limited amounts of endurance, very limited amount of time they could spend underwater, and very limited in terms of weaponry. As their range grew, their capability of others came about, and sometimes they retained a stealth. They laid mines rather than expose themselves to direct combat, but other times they didn't. And one of the things you have to remember the Royal Navy's thinking about when they're gearing up for World War II is, and when they're sort of gearing up thinking there's a war coming, is what kind of submarine warfare are they going to be facing? Is it going to be mine warfare, or is it going to be torpedo warfare, or basically opening a U-boat or submarine, fluffing up onto the surface and banging away with its gun? What kind of warfare are you going to be facing? When an ambush predator attacks a convoy or any formation, they depend upon speed. They're often a disadvantage in some way compared to their opponent. Hence the ambush is their form of attack. For example, if you're a submarine on the surface and there is a escort of any shape there, it's probably going to win a surface combat with you. You're doing the ambush because in a straight up fight you're going to lose. So you have to ambush. Now, you can say with torpedoes and doing a periscope-based attack on surface ships, they never lose to an extent that ambush capability, but they do. The moment you launch torpedoes, you reveal there's a submarine somewhere around, and they can follow the tracks back, and they can start looking at things and going, oh, well, something seems to be over there. We'll go have a look. The advantage only remains if the attack can be executed at speed. Any delay, any stalling allows the opponent to stop to think instead of just reacting. And that's the other thing you look when you're looking at wolf packs, etc., and the scenarios going on. One of the classic stories taught of the convoy war is the U-boats which were going down the centre of the convoys, which didn't really occur to a lot of the Royal Navy until some submarine officers, some Wrens, and an intelligence officer got together and went, hang on, let's run this simulator. This only works if someone's going down the centre of the convoy. And the moment the British realise it, you suddenly see a scenario where there are usually a flag-class corvette or a trawler or something else sitting in the middle of the convoy, which has guns. And when the U-boat comes long guns down the convoy going, yay! Bang! Bye-bye U-boat. And that tactic falls off. And that had been a tactic which was getting them a lot of kills because the escorts were on the outside of the convoy and they couldn't see what was going on in the inside of the convoy. And they were on the outside because the attack was presumably going to come from the outside. Now, okay, it's a very daring and very lucky U-boat commander who manages to get into a scenario where they flop up in the middle of the convoy. But pushing your luck doing it was a very high risk, high reward, very high reward once you got in. Now, as we mentioned, the sloops which were done in World War I started off actually more as minesweepers. The flag-class sloops of World War I were escort/minesweepers because that was the major scary weapon of German submarines in World War I. It wasn't their torpedoes, it was their mines. Mines killed far more than anything else did. These same flag class later became Q ships as well as straight-up escorts, but you know, it's fun. As submarines grew more capable and gained even greater potential as of the 1920s and 30s, the challenge for how to replicate the capability of escorts had achieved towards the end of World War I became increasingly something which different parts of the Royal Navy are working on. And this is another point which feeds into the earlier discussion point about the controller and the director of construction and the amount of information they're getting to put to the government. It's coming from many different sources. Now, as I mentioned, the Bridgewater class sloops are where a lot of the real formal development of the sloop line and the anti-submarine escorts starts off with in 1928. But it's the Bittons which are the point at which these things start to become more noticeable. As has been said, their hull machinery arrangement would be used as template for the Egret, Black Swan classes sloops, as well as the Hunt class escort destroyers. The armament of either 6 4-inch guns in 3 twin mounts or 4 4.7-inch guns in single mounts, as in Chargers were designed, 4.05-inch AA guns in single mounts and 60 depth charges were basically what becomes the template for arming small ships throughout the war. Especially fire class, which are of course chosen to have a single 4-inch BL Mark 9 gun forward, usually twin Vickers .5-inch gun machine gun mounts or twin .303 Lewis gun mount, 2 Mark II depth charge throwers, 2 depth charge rails, along with a total of 40 depth charges. This is what they have at the beginning of the war. As the war goes on, and especially as things are modified, both the ships which are built to modified standard and the regular built to the standard version flag class corvettes which are modified, the depth charges goes up, and they can carry 70. They gain a Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar. They gain some 20mm Oerlikons instead of the machine guns. And they gain a 2-pounder Mark 8 single pom-pom AA gun. I have to admit the AA gun comes in kind of early. The twin machine guns were mounted where later on the 20mm is mounted as a rule. But again, they occasionally moved around. And this particular drawing is kind of interesting because it has an interesting gun system back aft where the eventual pom-pom would go. That wasn't fitted on too many of them, but some did have it. Now, when you decided what the mission is, and you've worked out what it needs to accomplish the mission, you then need to consider what kind of, in terms of what equipment it needs and what operating characteristics it needs to accomplish the mission. You then have to look for your hull form, and this is where things get interesting. The actual hull and structure of the Flower class are listed often as coming from the Smith's Dock Company Limited, which is a medium-sized shipyard in the South Bank on River Tees in North Yorkshire. It's a yard with a very strong history. In World War I, they provided the successful Z-class whalers for anti-submarine work, and was one of the most famed yards for the construction of whalers in the country. The whaler type had been chosen because they were designed to be very tough and keep the sea in all weathers, hence the oceanic capabilities. They were also stable and designed to allow for working on deck in those rough weathers, which was important for something which is going to do anti-submarine warfare work in terrible weather. This was key if they would be used as the Admiralty wished, and the Admiralty did wish to use these ships for full-spectrum anti-submarine warfare support. Furthermore, the designer selected, William Reed, could have his pick of multiple designs to base it from. He didn't choose the most recent design for reference. Instead, he chose a vessel which had entered service in 1936, which had been built for the Southern Whaling and Sealing Company, was basically designed for very, very tough weather. Southern Whaling and Sealing Company was usually focused towards the South Atlantic, not exactly known for nice weather, and yeah, that's the basis. And then they modified it. This design is the Southern Pride, and the Southern Pride still design wasn't enough. Its length of 160 foot was 45 foot too short for the Iron's needs. Its speed of 15¼ knots was not fast enough. Its hotel load to support the crew had to more than double, as the whaler had a crew of 30, the corvette 85. It's actually nearly tripling it. And then, of course, its decks had to be strengthened. The routes between decks changed to accommodate transfer of ammunition from magazine to weapons. These, though, were all considered relatively straightforward things to do for William Reed and the DNC team who were watching over the work. They were all simple compared to the biggest change necessitated. Switching power from a water tube boiler system to 2 marine oil-fired boilers, as these engines could be supplied in about 16 weeks or just 4 months from existing contractors, as water tube boilers would not be available for at least 7 months. Now, water tube boilers are usually what are talked about at certain points, but they are actually very rare when it comes to things of this size. This is an Admiralty free drum boiler. This is a water tube boiler. It's got water tubes running all over around, which are heated. Now, this free drum system is very different to the actual system which tends to be used more often. And that tends to be what's sometimes referred to as a Scotch boiler. But we'll get to that in a second. We'll talk about these. These were standardised on all sorts of Royal Navy ships, on cruisers, destroyers, everything. So, of course, when the Royal Navy's looking for something, originally they wanted to have this. And then they realised, well, hang on. It was looking more and more like it's going to be closer and closer and closer, so it needs to be designed to be able to have either this or something which can be got more standardised, the Marine Scotch boilers, which are the standardised units. Basically, the fear was that if you had them reliant upon just these, the delays would be impossible for them to mount, and they'd be impossible for them to be getting out in time. And especially as it would put you into direct competition with the destroyers, cruisers, and pretty much everything else. Although it tends to be that cruisers, etc., have larger units, those units also come from the same manufacturers. Interesting enough, Southern Pride herself would serve the RM. Requisitioned and converted in 1940. It was wrecked off Freetown in June 1944. Her conversion, which is an illustration of the quality of the base design, which it had taken just 6 weeks and £75,000 to convert her to an acceptable escort. From July 1940, Southern Pride was captained by 4 lieutenants from the Royal Navy Reserve and Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, not unusual for what these escorts would be doing. N. Stapleton, 22nd of July to January 1941. B. Babb, January 1941 to 7th of February 1941. F. Dara, 7th of February 1941 to the 22nd of May 1943. And Giangus, 22nd of May 1943 to 16th of June 1944. Whilst in August 1940, she provided the other side of the exercise for anti-submarine, counter-anti-submarine training with the Dutch submarine HRMS 09. It was this convoy escort that she really showed her value. Taking part in many during her service, and often being called on like she was in Convoy WS-24, which was formed up on the 20th of October 1942, provide a solo escort for key vessels that had to be detached. In the case of that convoy, it was the troops transport Tamora, needing escort into Freetown, whilst the remainder of the convoy forged on to Brazil. The reason for needing her to do this was the convoy had been rerouted from its normal stopping off point of Freetown to keep well clear of convoys taking part in Operation Torch. The amount of complexity that goes into convoy operations is beyond what we normally talk about. Now, the free drum boilers, they're a cool system. They are a really, really cool system. And the whole purpose of them is to develop very high pressure steam. Okay, not as high pressure as some of their American, etc. counterparts, but these can grow and develop. And they're very, very reliable. The Royal Navy spends a lot of work, a lot of effort with Yarrows and with Vickers developing these and turning these into what they become, which is a very reliable boiler system. But saying that, and Yarrow is the major one, but Vickers and also I think I forgot to mention Thornycroft also have their involvement. They are complicated to build. Actually though, it's this boiler, the Scotch boiler type, which is the common one, and it's far more simple to produce and far more sensible to produce. And I'm going to talk this one through whilst you're seeing some video of me scrabbling all over one of Sackville's boilers, because they let me into the room. Now, I have to admit, I'm going to be talking over it, and you're not going to see me much of it, and occasionally my body when I get the camera wrong. But that's because it wasn't really the sort of space where I wanted a second person down there holding the camera while I was scrabbling around talking. So instead of me talking to camera, you can hear me talking while the video's playing. Hope you enjoyed. Now, the Scotch marine boiler is of course another version of a steam boiler, but this is a fire tube boiler, in that the hot flue gases pass through tubes set within a tank of water to create steam, rather than being small tubes passing through the fumes, passing through the combustion chamber. The general layout is that of a sort of horizontal cylinder, usually with one or more cylindrical furnaces as part of part of the cylinder. They're usually in the lower part of the boiler shell. Above this are many small diameter fire tubes. The gases and smoke from the furnace pass to the back of the boiler, then return through the small tubes up and out of the chimney. This means that the boiler is usually positioned in the ship just aft of the funnel, because the gases will go through it, then back through it, and then come out sort of the front. It's an interesting arrangement, but it's very efficient for its size and its cost. And this is why it's used by a lot of industrial and mercantile systems. The far end of the furnace tends to be an enclosed box, and it's called the combustion chamber, and this extends upwards to link up with the fire tubes. The front wall of the combustion chamber is supported against the steam pressure by the tubes themselves, and the rear face is stayed by rod stays through the rear shell of the boiler. Above the combustion chamber and tubes is an open steam collecting space. Larger rod stays run the length of the boiler through this space, supporting the ends of the boiler shell. Especially when there are multiple furnaces, there is a separate combustion chamber for each furnace. A few small boilers did connect them into one chamber, but this design is usually considered weaker. A more serious problem is the risk of reversing the draft, where exhaust from one furnace could blow back and out of the adjacent one, injuring the stokers working in front of it. So that's why they tended to not try that variant. Now, the design I showed at the beginning is of a 4-furnace boiler. Now, these were not the most common variant because they're quite powerful. Usually it's more likely 2 to 3. And their use in ships, well, this was fairly common. The Titanic had 29 boilers, 24 double-ended, 5 smaller single-ended, all pretty much of the Scotch Marine type. So it gives you an idea of how long these boilers have been around. In fact, they're still around to this day. They're still in production today. You can find and buy replacement Scotch boilers. So, theoretically, you could fit a new boiler into HMCS Sackville. You could do it. To be honest, looking at the boiler, it's been kept in fairly good nick, but I think I would want to replace it if I was going to do some serious steaming under its own power. Now, the fact is, these boilers were incredibly useful. Yes, they weren't as efficient or capable as such a powerful steam as the water tube boilers that we were talking about at the beginning, the free drum boiler system, but they are very, very capable. And, more importantly than anything, they are produced worldwide. They really are able to be serviced anywhere in the world, which is another essential criteria the Royal Navy were thinking about for these ships. When they'd been thinking about using the free drum boiler system, they'd thinking about commonality with the rest of the Royal Navy, which makes sense, but also gives you the advantage of, if you're ordering more of those free drum boiler types, you're going to be increasing capacity of their construction, which during long term, which would mean you could build more in any war scenario because you'd have greater in maritime infrastructure there. And remember, this is a Navy which has been doing a consistent maritime infrastructure program from the beginning of the 1930s. They have been building things up in order to be able to do the things they need to do. They've been investing. Now, especially in production of armour, but in the whole general marine industry, the Royal Navy has been investing since about 1932, but really Henderson had spearheaded and pushed this up. So, going initially with the free drum boiler design makes sense, because that's going to grow the capacity to build free drum boilers, which will help with, later on, with destroyers and other ship production. But, and this is the point you have to think about, it's not enough. Especially when you're looking at the pace and likelihood of war getting sooner, you then have to go for, right then, what's the next most logical system to use? The next most logical system to use is to use the most common boiler design on the planet. The boiler system which is in more merchant ships than any other system. Because that will work. And that will be able to be sustained and supported by industry anywhere in the world, because you will have literally an endless supply of people who are qualified to run them. Especially if you consider amongst the Royal Navy reservists who are in the Merchant Marine, they will really know these boilers. So these boilers are essentially a sign of the likelihood of war speeding up and getting closer. Now, another choice which actually made earlier in the design was how that steam created by boilers would be turned into power. You had a choice. You could go for turbines, which were also in need of expansion in terms of production capabilities, but were even more limited than the boilers, or you could go for triple expansion engines. As you've already seen, bit on the video, kind of given away, the Flowers went for a triple expansion engine. Again, for much the same reasons that they eventually went with the Scotch Marine boiler system, because it is produced so widely. And it is perfectly fine for something which you're building, which is going to be an endurance asset. It's going to be a long-range system. You can build marine engines, that is triple expansion, double-acting triple expansion engines, to be very efficient at long-range endurance. Might not be so. You can't necessarily build them to give you high speed. You can get with a turbine if you really push it, but you can definitely get endurance, and very efficient endurance. Now, the reason they're called double acting is because if they were single acting, you'd basically have the steam coming in, pushing down, and then escaping, and then sort of suddenly going up. And some of the original engines were like that. But double acting means you have the steam coming in from both ends of the valve. So, it'll come in from the top, push the valve down, and then that'll get shut off, and then the steam comes in from the bottom to push the valve up. And this, of course, gives you more power and more efficiency. It's especially true when you have 3 chambers, because that is what a triple expansion engine is about. It's about drawing the power out of the steam as much as possible. Now, normally what you have is these engines arranged in a high pressure cylinder, then a medium pressure cylinder, and then a lower pressure cylinder. Usually your higher pressure cylinder is going to be slightly smaller volume, so high, medium, low. These are designed to extract as much energy out of the steam as possible. And they work well, especially when they're double acting systems, because basically what happens is the steam passes from one of these chambers to the next chamber to the next chamber. Makes it as efficient as possible. It really does work well, and when you've got it all going and all the system working, you see these little sort of shifter doors, which are the ones which allow the steam in and the steam out between the various valves, picking which one the steam's going to. They get, of course, rotated by the same crankshaft. So it all works to get as much energy out of the system as possible, and this is what is critical. So, without much further ado, let's go look at the actual engine in Sackville. So, welcome to a triple expansion engine. In fact, the beating heart of HMCS Sackville. This is where the raw power of steam, all that heat, all that pressure, all that gas, is turned into motion and hopefully kinetic energy and movement. Via, I would have to say, an absolute lake of grease. This is what you realize when you get a good close-up look at a triple expansion engine. Everything is greased. Everything has to be greased because everything is moving. And it's also part of maintaining in the saltwater environment. This is one of the things you learn once you start dealing with naval history, once you start looking at naval things or maritime things as a whole. Saltwater is your enemy. Whoever's shooting at you, they're just a momentary aberration. Saltwater is your constant and continuous opponent. And it is far more deadly, as it always wins in the end. But here, they're doing a very good job of keeping that particular monster at bay, I think. Now, being given a triple expansion engine is a sensible choice for a ship which you want to have a range of, well, at least 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots, which is what they were originally designed for. It's a good, reliable engine for that kind of distance. But there is also, for the Royal Navy, a very big problem when it comes to these ships. They have a single triple expansion engine. Despite the amount of space you can see that this engine has to take up, the sheer size and scale of it, the fact that you'll see in a bit, it has its own crane built into the ship. Well, crane system to pulleys and the systems to move the heavy weight of objects around that are needed to maintain it and keep it going. And the way this space is crammed, it has a single engine, a single shaft, a single screw. It has 2 boilers, 1 engine, 1 shaft, 1 screw. This gives the Royal Navy a problem because the Royal Navy wasn't sure what to call these ships. You see, they weren't sloops because sloops were built to naval standards and these were being built to as mercantile standards as possible. And so they didn't want to call them the same thing as sloops because the Royal Navy at this period was very clear on you knew exactly what a ship was from its name. If it was a cruiser, you were dealing with a general purpose warship. If you had a destroyer, it was a vessel which existed around its torpedoes. It might have guns, it might not. That's why they also called tribal class destroyers originally tribals rather than destroyers. They were referred to as tribal flotillas because they were a destroyer built around their guns. And please notice that's Dr. Dan giving you a position of scale here. You'll see also Gareth wandering around. Both were helping me with filming this in the engine room. But you can see how quickly we are swallowed up in the space. This is a small ship, and yet it has this much space devoted to its engine room. It's another reason why, please note, that if the engine room gets a torpedo in it or anything else hits the engine room or the boiler room, that's usually toast for a corvette or any ship of this sort of size, because literally that space stretches from keel to the top of the ship. It is colossal. There are also some really cool dummies in Sackville, and the crew have positioned them round to make sure everything is sort of nice and you can see the space. And please, by the way, watch right to the end for some bloopers, because there are some bloopers from us from going around here. I wouldn't have made my dad or the chief very happy at certain points. We'll leave that to one side, because I was watching the camera more than where I was going. Very stupid, and I definitely advise people not to do that. Now, the Royal Navy had actually abolished corvette as a category in 1877. Corvettes and frigates were combined into the category of cruiser. This was because frigates by that point had grown, as I've told about when talking about HMS Warrior, which is going to be another part of this Christmas series. Frigates sort of became the battleships. The ironclad frigate, yes, it only had a single deck of guns, and yes, therefore it was a frigate, but it had armour, and it had very thick wooden hulls, and yeah, that's pretty much a battleship of its period. There are certainly no ships of the line which want to come up and meet it in other combat. So that gives you a problem. You can't call those things frigates anymore, and corvettes, well, they're similarly issue, and that's why cruisers get up here, because they are a cruiser. Well, in World War II sees the return of both corvette and frigate for these anti-submarine warfare vessels. The first in a generation are the corvettes and the Flagg-class corvettes, built around this whole design. Later on vessels, when they have more shafts, more screws, then they return to the frigate. And the frigate is also bigger in its sort of half mercantile, half naval sort of style construction. But really, please, and you can see the pulley system and etc. Its beam for support, the I-beam for supporting it, being really illustrated in these shots, for moving heavy equipment and the lids of cylinders especially, etc., when you're doing maintenance on them, because that stuff really weighs. These ships are corvettes because the Royal Navy needs a name for them. And the corvette used to be a small escort in Age of Sail times. It was actually a French name. The British had the brig. The British had all sorts of small ships which they called by various names. Sloop even had been around, and they turn around and go, right then, we're bringing back this name, we're bringing back corvette, because this will suit them. It's also to differentiate the fact that unlike the trawlers, these are not really built as small and cheap as they possibly can be. Yes, the Royal Navy builds a lot of trawlers in World War II, several hundred. And they take out into service from civilian life even more. But corvettes ain't no trawlers, and so they didn't want them considered under that same category. But as said, also not sloops. Now this is a wonderful engine to walk around, and I was very, very glad that we were allowed to walk around it as much as we were. I'm not sure if normally people are allowed to walk around them as much as we were. I would honestly say I highly doubt it, and I'm definitely sure normally you're not allowed to scramble around the boiler like I was. That was another reason why there was limited access in there. It wasn't exactly probably the most sensible or safe thing to do, but I did it, and I was being well looked after while doing it and well watched. Now, in the US Navy, though, Flagg-class vessels were called Temptress and Action class gunboats. They carried the patrol gunboat designation of PG. But in the Royal Navy, and all the various branches of the Royal Navy, and the French Navy, and most of the Allied navies, they were called corvettes. After World War II, because of these triple expansions, these Scotch boilers, these very easy to maintain systems, they would actually stay in service. in these navies for many, many years. Sackville is a good example. She serves the Royal Canadian Navy with a single boiler for many years because she's had a boiler accident. She lost one of her boilers. And she's converted into an oceanography vessel. And this is one of the reasons why she's still with us today. And we can thank the fates for that, because there are literally no other survivors. And because she was being used as an oceanography vessel. Because with her Scotch boiler, with her triple expansion engine, she's very cheap and easy to maintain. There's a wealth of parts going around. But after World War II, the Flower class went off and served with the Argentine Navy, the Chilean Navy, the Royal Danish Navy, the Dominican Navy, the Egyptian Navy, the Royal Hellenic Navy, the Royal Indian Navy, the Israeli Navy, the Irish Naval Service, the South African Navy, the Bolivarian Navy of Venezuela, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Royal Thai Navy, and the Yugoslav Navy. Again, another navy I missed out earlier that they of course didn't serve with was the Soviet Navy, which is kind of strange because you'd think these would have been perfect ships for them to pick up. But they didn't want to order them from foreign yards. They were more interested in trying to get Archangelisk and heavy cruisers, i.e. prestige status units, than they were in what would have been very practical vessels for helping them with the Arctic convoys, etc. Now, you are probably looking around this engine room in this video and thinking, is there anything like free space in here? No, it is crammed as full as you can possibly imagine it. And what is the advantage of us going around it this time is, apart from being able to see, and I will keep emphasising, the sea of grease, the lake of grease that is used to keep this engine going, and still preserved to this day. Just imagine it with even more of the stuff on it when it was in service. There would literally be grease everywhere. Imagine how noisy, how almost claustrophobic it would have been when that engine was on and running. That engine is not a quiet system.
Illuminated.
That engine is a very, very loud system.
The other side,
and it's going to keep being loud.
From the one, yeah. Just put a little bit of light in there.
But still, it's cool to look at, and it is so emotive.
Is the light on?
I mean, I was wandering around this class, and I was wandering around Sackville and this engine, and just thinking of all the people who served in here, of all the heat, of all the fury they saw. And looking into this area, and I was thinking about the number, with all this stuff whirring around, the hands which would have had to gone into it. The amount of effort that would have to gone into it to keep it going, because you do not want that engine to shut down. Yes, marine boilers, Scotch boilers, and triple expansion engine systems are incredibly resilient. They're incredibly hardworking. They're incredibly survivable. But when you're in the middle of the Atlantic, the North Atlantic, and the seas are swelling around you, and the ocean is pounding, and you are having to make all these controls do what you want by turning these dials, by turning these wheels, by basically it's a judgment call and experience almost every time, with people watching you occasionally, but very soon you're left to your own devices and you're supposed to be doing and executing instructions as soon as they're shouted out. This engine is also incredibly resilient. So you can maintain it under those conditions. You can keep it going. I wouldn't say it's idiot-proof. Nothing is idiot-proof. We know nothing is more ingenious than an idiot if they really want to do something. But it is designed in such a way that it is very easy to monitor. Because, again, it's designed, and these systems are all designed, around merchant crews who want to be as fewer people as possible. Because people are expensive. I know it's considered a modern thing that people are expensive and that wages are expensive, but no, people have always been considered expensive assets. And now you're going to sort of follow me in a second as I go up and out of the engine room. I've gone up to the first floor gantry, if you consider the the ground floor being the level below the keel. And I've got to go up again. I've got to go up to where you can see Gareth up there. At that point, actually being my spotter and actually telling, he would shout out a little bit after this that I was actually about to kill myself. And then disappears off. He's a nice guy. This was a really cool place to be going around. But again, as you can see, I'm on the first floor and I have to get up to the second to get out. So think about that in any scenario where this vessel happens to be sinking. Think about that in any scenario. Getting from the bottom to the top. Yes, you can get there fairly quickly, but if there's anything going on, any damage, etc., this is going to not be an easy task. And then we can see it from top. And you can see where they've actually cut through that beam that's used as a sort of pulley crane position. You can see where they cut it through. Not sure why I was focusing on the door then, but probably the shaded thickness of the steel. And there's the pulley crane. And, oh yes, press reception area. The changes they make in order to sustain things and allow people to walk around them. And now, once you get past the engines though, what's the next big thing? The next big thing that drives the size of the ship, the scale of the ship. It's the weapons you want to fit in it. The engines give you the performance characteristics. The weapons are what you want to be taking around. So you have a 4-inch 45. Now, a 4-inch 45 is not the world's most advanced weapon. It's certainly not the high-angle system we associate with much of World War II in terms of anti-aircraft capability. This can actually do -10 to +30 degrees. So, yeah, it fires at 10 to 12 rounds per minute, 800 meters per second, maximum firing range, 12.6 kilometers. What is it good for, therefore? Well, the important thing it is there for is to deal with submarines on the surface. And this is one of the few last surviving examples. There's a gun at Port Isaac in Cornwall. There's one in Leaf Harbour in South Georgia. There's one at the entrance to the marina in Hull in UK. And then there is this one. Well, not this one. There is the equivalent of this one on HMCS Sackville. These guns had first been developed in, well, World War One. And they built roughly 2,000. Nearly two, well, depending on who you're talking to, they'll say 2,000 plus. They'll say nearly 2,500. Or there are some people who give surprisingly accurate figures of 2,382, which comes from Campbell's Naval Weapons of World War II, I think. And there's a case of, I think possibly you might be right, but also I think this was quite such a ubiquitous system that there is quite a potential that the rather like town-class cruisers, where the Admiralty occasionally had to be reminded that they actually had more than they thought they did, there is quite a possibility that there are more of these produced. This was the last breech-loading 4-inch gun in British service. All subsequent guns used charges in metal cartridges and were quick-firing designated. So, the Hedgehog. It's a really cool system, but it does have some problems. It basically needs direct contact in order to kill, because this weapon, despite being not the easiest to lift around yourself, it's quite comfortable, but it's not exactly something you'd want to be doing for, I don't know, kitchen cutlery. It's not that massive. It's direct contact on a submarine, it kills. Anything around a submarine, it just deafens. Which is why they grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And you have the squid, which comes out, which is basically take a depth charge, stick it on a mortar system, and launch it. And then eventually the limbo, which is, what happens if we make a depth charge really big?
Basically go back to the Mark I depth charge, which was Jellicoe's idea, which was just a sea mine with a hydrostatic pistol attached.
It worked.
Ooh.
It might have been slightly overkill, but it
As
worked.
long as you got out of the area very, very quickly. Hence why you put it on a launcher.
Which is also why the numbers go down. If we look at this, you'll see that the Hedgehog has a bank of 4 by 6, so it's 24 roughly here.
Yes.
On this one.
It's called
So-
the Hedgehog because of the spikiness of the launcher system.
Yeah, yes, which is why it's called the Hedgehog. But as you go down, they go into sets of 3 because they're a lot bigger and they don't need to be in quite such direct contact to get a kill. But still, would you want to be in a sub with 24 of these raining down on you? And why has the Hedgehog needed to come about? Well, the Hedgehog was a great system for an Aztec ship. A ship which had Aztec could stand back and use the Hedgehog without risking, and it's an important thing, without risking losing contact. And that was what had traditionally happened when the ship which was dropping depth charges loses contact as the submarine passes into its blind spot of its Aztec search. Now, this had led to a scenario where you often had ships trying to keep with multiple ships to engage a submarine. So you would have 2 or 3 vessels involved, with 1 to 2 maintaining contact with Aztec to keep track and signalling using radio, or sometimes just up there, if the radio wasn't working, trying to use their flags to signal what the submarine was doing, or flashing, using signal lamps, and another vessel would do the attack with its depth charges and its run of depth charge. Well, with Hedgehog system, with the various systems which come after it, the vessel can stand back and it can go, what are you doing? I'm still maintaining contact. I know your depth, I know your position, boom. And it's another problem for the submarine to deal with. Which also, of course, does lead to a counter-response by the Germans, which is the homing torpedo. So you can fire it and then run away. You don't have to try and take careful measurements. You can move out as quickly as you can. But everything is a response and counter-response, and this is a very scary system for the Germans to have to deal with. And as it develops and gets more, as already discussed, the bigger the weapons get, the more dangerous they get. Especially in wartime. They don't really develop much more. The Hedgehog is really deployed. The systems which come after it, the Squid and the Limbo, were both upgraded over time. What they found was the Hedgehog, which was called it because it was a load of spigot mortars with these things attached, and originally was called the anti-submarine projector, I think? Yes, the anti-submarine projector. Sounds so nice. Anyway, the point is, if they fire just one set of these, they're launching 24. If they fire 2, they're launching 48. When they tried to upgrade to the Squid, the idea was that would take a whole depth charge, and the Limbo would take a massive depth charge, which came later post-World War II. But they tried off the Squid with just using 3, and they eventually upgraded to the double Squid, and of course double Limbo, because it was found that 3 wasn't enough. Even though they were a lot bigger, 3 was not enough. You needed at least 6 or more. But no. Hedgehog mortar system, a very useful way of dealing with the fact that submarines were finding a way around your depth charges. And they also were requiring a lot more ships. Okay, once you start to have the Hedgehog system in service, you can have a ship-on-boat combat, i.e. one-on-one, and have a fairly good chance of success. The submarine can't dodge last minute and avoid the depth charges. Whereas previously, to avoid it dodging, as mentioned earlier, you needed multiple vessels engaging. And that meant if you had 12 vessels, let's say they were doing 2-vessel attacks, they could mostly deal with 6 submarines at a time. 7th submarine in the Wolfpack, completely unmolested, untouched. Whereas if you have 8 boats attacking, and you have 12 escorts, the dream, well, this means suddenly 8 escorts can go off and engage you, 2 more can probably be watching, and 2 more can just keep the convoy in case anything else turns up. That's what you want. And that's the advantage of the Hedgehog system. Slowly working our way from bow to stern in weapons, if you've not realised yet. And then we'll go up again to the sensors, and I'm going to do radar and Aztec together. So even though Aztec's technically at the bottom of the ship, I'm going to do it when we're talking about radar as well, because the two are combined in terms of their anti-submarine utility. It'll make sense when I get depth charges. One of the most simple weapon systems you will ever come across. It starts off with some very interesting ideas for anti-submarine warfare. They include 16 pounds of gun cotton charge in a lanyard can. They would lash two of these together, and that became known as depth charge Type A. And the idea was to drop these charges against submerged targets, attach the lanyards, and the lanyard is pulled to trigger them. Okay. The lanyards had a habit of tangling and failing to function, which led to the development of a chemical pellet trigger known as the Type B. These were effective at a distance of around 6.1 metres. In 1913, the Royal Navy Torpedo School described a device intended as countermining, or dropping a mine. And it was Admiral John Jellicoe's request that the Stardust Mark II mine was fitted with a hydrostatic pistol. Now, this hydrostatic pistol is literally a pressure depth gauge, which can be preset. So when it reaches, the charge reaches a certain depth, it goes off. This would be developed in 1914 by Thomas Firth and Sons of Sheffield. It was preset to 45 feet or 14 metres at firing to be launched in from a stern platform, so rolled off. They weighed in at roughly 1,100 pounds or 520 kilograms and were effective at 30 metres. The design was worked on by HMS Vernon, and the first effective depth charge, the Type D, became available in January 1916. It was a barrel-like casing containing TNT, but occasionally amatol, when TNT became scarce. And there were literally two sizes. Type D, which had a 300-pound charge for fast ships, and Type D Star, with a 120-pound charge for ships too slow to leave the danger area before the more powerful charge detonated. Because these charges were just as dangerous to the ships launching them as they were to the ships the boats which they were attacking them with. The hydrostatic pistol was actuated, i.e. worked, by water pressure at the pre-selected depth, as has been said. And initial depth settings were fixed to 40 or 80 feet, that's 12 or 24 metres. However, as amazing as they were, production couldn't keep up with demand, and anti-submarine vessels initially carried only 2 depth charges to be released from a chute at the stern of a ship. This, for some reason, didn't have much success. It's basically like sending soldiers to war with only 2 rounds for their rifle. It's not really going to win you any battles. First success was the sinking of U-68 off Kerry Island on 22nd of March 1916 by HMS Farnborough, which was a Q ship. And when I say a Q ship, she was not a Q ship of the, how do I put this politely, of the Flower class type, but an earlier one. Germany finally became aware of depth charges because of U-67, which was attacked unsuccessfully and in April 1916, and then 5 days later U-69 also attacked in April 1916. During 1916, only 2 more submarines were actually sunk by depth charges, UC-19 and UB-29. Number of depth charges carried increased to 4 in June 1917, 6 in August, and 30 to 50 by 1918. The weight of charges and racks actually caused instability, unless either heavy gun and torpedo tubes were moved to compensate, or other methods were occasionally found to try and lighten the ship so the top weight didn't cause trouble. Improvements in the pistols, in the hydrostatic pistols, allowed for depth settings greater in terms of their breadth, and you could adjust it in 15-meter increments from 50 feet to 200 foot. That's 15 to 61 meters. And even slower ships could use the Type D at below 100 feet. That's the big explosion, and at 10 knots or more. So the D Star was thankfully withdrawn at this point. Monthly use of depth charges increased from 100 to 300 per month during 1917 to an average of 1,750 by my calculations, but I've seen figures going as high as 1,800, and 1,745 seems to be quite popular, so I might be doing rounding errors. I think my maths versus the other maths, it might be I'm adding to it or I'm changing the months around. During the last 6 months of World War I, the Type D could be detonated as deep as 300 foot by that date. And by the war's end, 74,441 depth charges had been issued by the RN, 16,451 fired, 38 kills had been succeeded, and 140 more had been aided in. The US Navy requested and were granted the full working drawings of the device in March 1917. At which point, a US Navy engineer made some modifications on behalf of the Bureau of Naval Ordnance, painted it in the US, and therefore they avoided paying the original inventor, who was of course the British. Which was a little bit, let's be honest, that's a little bit cheeky. A little bit cheeky. There are multiple delivery mechanisms used. There's the ash cans off racks at the stern. This is of moving an attack off. This is done when you've got a moving attacking vessel, but that gives you a very limited pattern, and you want to drop depth charges in patterns because, especially when you're doing an ASDEC lock, and ASDEC is the important tool as time goes on, you lose the submarine in your ASDEC when you are passing over them. So they might make maneuvers. So you want to be able to drop as broad a coverage of depth charges as possible, which is why you start to create the depth charge throwers. And in this case, it's called a K-gun, and this is a Mark 7 depth charge being loaded onto HMS Dianthus's K-gun to throw these depth charges. They got pretty good, and the K-gun is standardized in 1942, replacing the Y-gun as the primary depth charge projector. K-guns fired one depth charge at a time and could be mounted on the periphery of the ship's deck, which freed up valuable centerline space, which originally the Y-gun sort of needed to be on. 4 to 8 guns were typically K-guns were tended to be mounted per ship, and they were used together with the stern racks to create patterns of 6 to 10 depth charges being dropped. Still though, and this is the point of depth charges, you have to move at a pretty fast clip as you're going across in order to not be damaged. Okay, the next video stuff coming up from Sackville is probably the most fun we had. We managed to, as a group, get together and operate the quick-firing 2-pounder. They have a Mark 8 style 2-pounder in a Mark 8 manual system. I can absolutely recommend 3 things. 1, despite many attempts, we didn't manage to get the drone. We were aiming for it, but Drac proved a very skilled pilot. 2, probably part of the problem was that it was being crewed by naval enthusiasts rather than naval naval personnel. 3, we did have targets of consolation, trains, ferries, things which were far more predictable than a drone in its terms of flight pattern. And yeah, it was a really, really interesting system. Now, what you have to remember with this particular system is that whilst they're technically a 2-pounder, there was a high velocity round developed, which was actually weighed in at 1.8 pounds. And this raised gun muzzle velocity from 2,040 feet a second to 2,400 feet per second in the Mark 8. The Mark 8 was an improved version of the Mark II. And the Mark II had been around since prior to World War One. Really, it was in service in the Royal Navy in 1915, but had been around a bit before then. And the Mark 8 had an effective range of 3,960 meters in terms of anti-aircraft ceiling, a maximum flat range of 6,220 meters. And, well, total mass of the entire system was roughly 400 kilograms. This is compared to the Mark II, which you found in several other systems, naval trawlers, motorboats and armed yachts, which was, of course, the World War I era version, which displaced a slightly lighter 239 kilograms, had an effective range of 1,200 yards, or that's 1,100 meters, and a muzzle velocity of 1,920 feet per second. They are good systems. They are very good systems for these ships in terms of being able to provide them with defense against aircraft and small boats. And that's exactly what they were for. Were they the greatest anti-air system you could fit on a ship? No, they're not. Were they capable of deterring aircraft from making an attack on this craft? Yes. Were they, combined with multiple other ships, able to put up a battery of fire against individual aircraft going low over them? Yes. Could they engage high-flying condors flying over them? Nope. You'd need to change the 4-inch gun for a 4-inch high angle or other weapon to have a chance with those. These were basically weapons designed to deal with light strikes and quick strikes by aircraft and try and deter them. But still, they gave a lot of morale, and along with machine guns, certainly any strafing fighter, etc., would probably be best advised to avoid the Flower-class corvette. The risk versus reward is not very good, unless you're sure they don't see you coming.
Now I can track. Again, let me get under the rope before you go too far around.
No, I'm just getting lined up on the train.
You two targeting trains again?
Yeah. It's halfway up.
Yeah, right. So now I'm focused on the end of the gun barrel.
Right, we're going for the ferry. Right, hang on. Let me start and raise and we'll go down.
Yeah.
Because then you get movement.
Ready?
Yeah. Required.
Down.
That's it. There.
On.
Get a view for that. Put the camera on there.
Tracking. I hear a drone.
Yeah. Got it.
Firing. Safety off. I'm not getting up at the safety hit. But I know that the breech is welded shut, so because the chief told me. And whilst I do agree that all
Oh, hang on. There is the drone.
Yeah.
drone
Targeting drone.
Not get it,
Yeah.
bring it around, put it all the way around. I'll keep it low until the run back.
Careful. Down, down, down.
Just sit in the front, that's the thing that sticks.
Ah.
Right, hang on.
On.
Desperately need to get before he moves that again.
And I'm going to quick.
Okay, where's that ferry gone?
You could probably take out the ferry with one of those.
I reckon we can take
There's the train over there. They are actually swinging around now to fight the train.
your arms in on this. Oh, do they get on these again?
Well, I'd say that goes from...
Swing around, we'll get her, we'll get her.
Oi! That goes from about... Unsurprisingly, considering how many of them there were, this is a class which is absolutely massive in terms of their range of service experience. So I'm going to start off by giving you a few examples. There is USS Tenacity. Started life like many of the class which would serve with the US Navy as a Royal Navy conveyor, under the name of Candy Tuft. Now, her number was KO9, and strangely enough, the modified flag class vessel, the same name, which was originally given the same name, Candy Tuft, K484, would be transferred to the Royal Navy and Canadian Navy to serve as HMCS Long Branch. So it seemed the Royal Navy didn't want to keep a Candy Tuft for long. Candy Tuft would take in safe convoy 500 ships across 13 North Atlantic and 2 Gibraltar convoys. Yet, despite her service, she was needed elsewhere. In March 1942, under the terms of the reverse Lend-Lease, Candy Tuft became Tenacity, one of the USN's Temptress-class gunboats, and was served with further distinction as part of the 4th Fleet based out of Trinidad. In this, she followed sisters such as HMS Hearties, which was USS Courage, but also at one point during construction HMS Pansy, and HMS Periwinkle, USS Restless. It was not just the USN and RCN, though, that gained these ships. HMS Buttercup, which alone formed 50% of the Free Belgium Navy, HMS Godetia being the other 50%, had been ordered on the 8th of April 1940, flying the Belgian flag from 23rd of May 1941, but not commissioned until the 24th of April 1942. She didn't serve as distinction until she returned in 1944 after the liberation of Belgium, but Buttercup would not serve long as such because in December of that year, the Royal Norwegian Navy borrowed her to replace their Castle-class vessel HMS Tunsberg-class after she was lost to a mine off the coast of Finnmark. She served so well that in 1946 the Norwegian government acquired her permanently, giving her the new name HNOMS Nordican. Not all vessels, though, gain new names with their new service. The Halbard, a vessel under construction in France when they fell to German invasion, as such, the Nazis not only stripped the Royal Navy of a valuable ally of war, but acquired some of the very vessels they'd been planning on fighting it. And although these ships have been being built to a modification of the original William Reed design, they were pretty similar to the traditional flag-class corvette. The Germans completed the vessel, which they termed Patrolboot Ausland, which literally translates as patrol boat from abroad, to their own further modification of that design. As it was, of the 4, only 3 were really completed, and that was only after a 4-year program. 4 years to complete a flag-class corvette. Yeah, those yards are really putting in the effort. PA3, Sabre, completing in November 1943, PA1, Argubus in April 1944, and PA2, Halberd being the first in service in September 1943. Despite this leisurely construction pace and late delivery, all of them had active careers, and proved the value of their simple and sturdy design philosophy that permeated the class. They actually were key convoy assets for the Germans in their coastal convoys. These vessels were absolutely critical for some of their operations. They were flag-class corvettes. Sadly enough, of course, as we discussed, the only survivor of the class is HMCS Sackville, but she has a story to tell of survival. A torrid start to her career, illustrating all the worst vices which came from having to generate crews from scratch at such a pace. Her first leader had issues with drunkenness, and basically it ends up with them. They get the ship back from its supposed pre-commissioning exercise. They quietly remove the leader because there's been basically mutiny against the commander. They disperse the crew to other ships, and then they bring in a whole new crew and definitely a new commanding officer, and she gets on to a better life. It shows the challenge of securing leaders, and especially experienced officers who understood how to navigate at this time, for the number of ships you're actually generating. During the war, she had quite a lot of experience, but she also had engineering issues, including her boiler blowing up. This is why she's down to one boiler. Post-war career, she became, in many ways, standing for what pre-war would have been a sloop. She became a survey ship, similar to HMS Rockrose, which served as a survey ship for the South African Navy, as HMSAS Protea post-World War II. And it's sort of a completion of the cycle, with the sloop being used to define the Corvette becoming the sloop. There are some epic jewels though in history. There's HMS Dianthus, which of course I had a picture earlier of her K depth charge launcher. She had an absolute duel with U-379. It was a marathon of a battle. This involved not just an Aztec hunt and depth charging, which were rather common, but also repeated ramming, firing pretty much every weapon both sides had, and constant calculation of the commanding officers of both vessels. It illustrates one of the constant problems for a convoy escort, though. Driving off and pursuing an opponent may lead to a kill, will at least remove them from the threats to the convoy, but also reduces the escorts with the convoy to deal with the other threats that may appear. A reality which doesn't make for a good movie, although something which is part of the movie that started a flyer class. Yeah. Then there's HMS Coroposis, a vessel of the original order, laid down in September 1939 and commissioned in August 1940, transferred to Greece in 1943, and served distinction till decommissioned in June 1952. A career which had already included rescuing survivors from victims of U-47, U-92 and U-130. She represented her sisters as HMS Compass Rose during the filming of The Cruel Sea. This movie, of course, had many great moments and has provided much of the image that affects the popular perception of Flower Class and their crews to this day. I could then read the rest of the section of my introduction of the Flower Class book I'm writing, but I won't. I'll leave that up to your imagination for a moment until I finish it. It seemed pertinent.
Now, as we step into the command space on a Flower Class corvette, and yes, this is the wheelhouse. This is where the ship was steered from. Up above, the flying bridge is where the commanders would be, where they'd be making the tactical decisions. Down below, they'd batten the hatches, especially at night when they had to have lights on, so people couldn't see their light going out. And this is where they'd sit. This is where you'd have the ASDIC operator sitting. This is where you'd have all these people sitting in here quietly, trying to concentrate and listen. And where you'd have someone manning the wheel and actually steering the ship. The point about ASDIC is that it had been around long enough. I know there's a lot of perception that it comes about just for World War II. It had been around since the 1920s, that the Royal Navy knew exactly what kind of space it needed to be operated in. And they knew they needed to try and keep it quiet, which is why they've built this space like it is, and why the Flower Class are laid out as they are in this scenario.
In the Battle Atlantic, the Royal Navy has been having ASDIC around since 1920, the Type 112, which was fitted to V&W class destroyers and P&PC class sloops. In 1930, they fitted a Type 119 to the B class destroyers. The A class destroyers hadn't originally had anything. Type 121 was tested in 1931 on the Woolston, and then was fitted to the D, E, F and G class destroyers, and some cruisers, and the sloop HMS Enchantress. Oh, which class did HMS Enchantress come from again? I'm sure I didn't mention that earlier. The Type 122, which was detachable and designed for trawlers and other auxiliaries with a turbo alternator. The Type 123, which came into service in 1934, again detachable, replaced the Type 122 and designed for ships with a high-frequency motor alternator. Type 124, which was fitted to the CH, I, J, K and Travel class destroyers, as well as some sloops and older destroyers. And this was the first system with a range recorder. Then the Type 127, 1937 the system, designed for sloops but widely fitted in frigates and older destroyers. Again, there was the Type 128, which was fitted to the A, L and Hunt class destroyers. Developed and tested in 1937 first. Type 141, which was the American system which was fitted in the Lend-Lease Town class destroyers when modified with British range and bearing recorders. And the eventual Type 144 series, which are designed to things that work with Hedgehog, and the 145, which is also like for Hedgehog but for slower escorts, i.e. some of the corvettes. And the Type 147, which was designed to work with Squid and was first tested aboard Ambuscade in May 1943. There are lots of these systems being developed, and they are critical. Absolutely critical. But what's also critical about them is the scenarios they're used in. These systems, ASDIC, radar, all these systems are critical for making these ships work, because you need both. ASDIC is good at detecting submarines moving underwater, but your radar, well, you have a surface search radar which can pick up periscopes. This again depends on the type. Different radars were good at different things. If you were on a Canadian vessel, there is a chance you would be built with a surface warning, first Canadian, SW1C, occasionally an SW2C, surface warning, second Canadian. However, if you go and look at Sackville, you will find she's still fitted with a Type 271, which was a British centimetric target indication radar. Now, this is actually shown in its original lantern-style radome, which I got really up close and personal with, as you'll see in one of the videos. And is a really interesting system for that, in that they had to design something which was strong enough to protect the radar and the sensitive materials inside it from the North Atlantic and the major waves, but also which would allow it to see outside. Type 27 was critical as it allowed escorts to reliably detect surface U-boats or even just their periscopes at range. Why is that matter? Well, in the Arctic or the Atlantic, often you'd see a periscope a lot further away than you'd hear a submarine. Submarine, especially when it's just sitting there, idling or moving very, very slowly on batteries, is very quiet. Very, very quiet. When it starts moving slightly faster, or it fires weapons, that's when you can hear it. But honestly, you can't get much out of it if you are just using those systems, those undersea systems. If you're using radar, though, you can see the periscope. Whether it's moving or not, it will stick out. And if the submarine's on the surface, a trick they did try and use to try and confuse ASDIC because it wasn't that good at detecting surface targets, well, again, they'd stick out even further. And that was fine because, well, you have various systems that will help you. You have rockets you can fire to light up the night sky. And you have a 4-inch gun, which can make a surface target, especially a submarine, very unhappy with the right data. And again, the odds are, if the submarine's on the surface and detected by the radar, it's going to be not long before it's in range of that 4-inch gun. Why does this matter? Because the war with the submarines is not necessarily about kills. The convoy war is not about a battle between ships and boats. It's about getting ships from A to B. If you get your ships to your destination, you have won. Now, admittedly, Bletchley Park and the intelligence information that provided allowed for the routing of many convoys around. They couldn't route them all, and they had to provide reasons, and the more you had developments in long-range maritime patrol, the more you had other systems being developed, escort carriers, etc., the more plausible reasons there were for submarines to be found, for things to be spotted, that didn't go back to intelligences reading your information. Or, again, you're broadcasting at full power and do not seem to understand how to control the power of your broadcast. So you're giving away your position with your signals traffic analysis. All these things the Germans seem to miss, thankfully, for the war effort. From the Allies' perspective, it does make the war a lot shorter and a lot less painful than it could have been otherwise. But the fact is, that still means some convoys are still going to run into wolf packs. And again, if you can stop those wolf packs being on the surface, managing to run on diesel rather than batteries, not using their precious oxygen, not being limited to the view of their periscope, which is just above the waves, and even being scared to put their periscope up because that can be detected, and trying to do everything passively without sticking these things up, you reduce the area of effect of those submarines dramatically. And that's a win. Because if the submarine fails to engage, that's one less submarine targeting your ships. And the win isn't killing the submarine, the win is getting your ships through. If the submarine engages, then killing it to stop, or killing it or driving it off, again, driving it off does, so that your convoy gets through without losses, is the win. The moment you start losing ships, that's when you have a problem. Because then it becomes a production race. Who can build and build more merchant ships and send more supplies versus who can build more submarines and torpedoes. And that's not a race you want to be in. You want to do everything you can to make your task on the construction side as minimal as possible. The Germans are doing the same on theirs. They're trying to up the science and technology and capabilities of their submarines. But again, it's a reactive process. They have to realise what's going on. They have to realise, hang on, they're not using rails for the depth charges, they're using something else. Hang on. If we found that if we did a radical manoeuvre, we tried it, we got away from the Aztec. We got away from the boat. Oh, well, that'll spread around, we'll try that again. We think they're using a new system because this vessel, they got destroyed and they seem to be in that position and we were listening and they tried a manoeuvre but it didn't work, they didn't throw them. That gets back. Or we survived but it came very close. Which with Hedgehog is possible if they're deep enough, because those are small, those are just spigot mortar systems, it's possible they can get away. But again, it's all the sensors and it's the control systems they have that make the difference. It's the crews which matter. In many ways, the crews are far more difficult for the Royal Navy and the Allies to replace than the ships are with the Flower class, because they are able to be built in so many different facilities and are built in such numbers. Saying that, as I've mentioned before, 33 Flower class vessels are lost in World War II. 22 of those losses are credited to submarines. It is believed that Flower-class corvettes participated, or are credited with fully, the sinking of 47 German and 4 Italian submarines. 51 submarines. The more difficult number to estimate is how many German and Italian submarines didn't make their attack because of the Flower-class corvettes. How many
because of the presence of the vessels, because of the radar, because of their manoeuvring, didn't manage to get a line of sight, didn't manage to get a kill, didn't manage to even fire their torpedoes. How many, as said at the beginning, decided not to fire their torpedoes because firing their torpedoes and hitting a Flagg-class corvette, it's something you can go home and say we did, but it's not really something you can go home and really brag about, because the Flagg-class corvette is the smallest of the small. The only thing smaller than that is you took out a PT boat or MT motor torpedo boat? Really? You wasted a torpedo on a motor torpedo boat? Didn't it just go straight underneath the Fairmardie? This is the reality for submarine commanders. Because these are the vessels which are coming to take them out. These are the numbers vessels. I know, we talk about the frigates, we talk about the destroyers dashing backwards and forwards. You see, especially in modern movies, they talk about these ships as the bigger ships. The corvettes were the numbers. You look at the convoys, the corvettes are the numbers, especially the close-in protection, especially the anti-submarine protection. They're the vessels which are going around shepherding, protecting those merchant vessels. And without them, well, the war would not have been able to be won. Without a vessel like the Flagg-class corvette, it wouldn't have been able to be won. But the summary will be after we've had a closer up look at So this is where the radar was. This is what it was kept in. And this is its position. As you can see, the mast is now behind it. But that's still a pretty big object. And even visually, you can see a lot from up here. You can even look down and see a Drachenfels talking to the chief of the boat, who was a very nice gentleman. It was a great view from up here. You can see the pom-pom down aft, and you can see the funnel, and I did actually climb the funnel as well, but I don't think I put the video for that in here. And you get a good look around Halifax, Nova Scotia, but of course, please do not go up this position, because you really shouldn't. Really not sensible. But this is where the radar was stored. This is its cupola. This is its protection. To provide it with protection, this is what it's in. Its frame, everything, to stop it getting damaged by the wind, by the waves, by the saltwater spray. All these things were dangerous to antennize. And when your life and your ability to do the job depends on something, you protect it. And they also have this little walkway around here so it couldn't be checked on. It needed to be checked on. But it's not the highest position. And yes, someone could theoretically climb the mast and get into a higher position to watch out and watch what's going on. So were the Flagg-class worth it? Well, I'd say they were. They definitely provided the Allied navies with the critical mass they needed to fight the convoy war. Yes, we're always bombarded with ideas of they weren't as good, they weren't as this, they weren't that. And the Royal Navy introduces frigates and all these bigger ships which come in. They're just ever so slightly bigger and slightly better and slightly newer and slightly cooler. And the thing is, yeah, those are the better ships. But when the Royal Navy needs the crunch time, in 1942, in 41 and 43, the ships which are providing the mass, the ships which are providing the core of the effort that will do the convoy war, that will get those convoys across those vital supplies, it's the Flagg-class corvettes. Every single time. But really, we shouldn't finish without talking about Sackville. So HMCS Sackville, what can we conclude by looking at her? At this beautiful example of role-driven form, of function-driven form, of functionality given form, of a green, historically accurate maple leaf. Well, she's kept very well by the crew who take care of her, and frankly, the Sackville Association is owed a massive thanks for preserving the last remaining of the Flagg-class corvettes. It's sad she's the only one, but it's good that they take such good care of her, as she's a fitting memorial for this wonderful class and all they achieved. So, before the outtakes and all the bloops reel, let's talk about what we've got coming up. We've got in January the Battle of Coronel in retrospect on the 6th of January. That's going to be cool.
We have on the first... Ooh, let's see, what we've got. Ooh, I haven't online them, but I've got Calypso class, protected corvette. That's on Tuesday this week. Then USS Wichita on Wednesday. Cool. Thursday is going to be the patron suggestion, number 69. Cody's the logistics of colonization, both historically and interplanetary interstellar. That's going to be fun. A sci-fi history-themed discussion, I think. And then it's the Soviet Navy, 1965 to 91. And then, HMS Warrior on Monday the 19th. That's going to be fun. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for all your support. I really wouldn't be able to do any of this without you, so thank you, and hope you enjoyed. So, that was the Sackville. Hope you've enjoyed it. Please stay tuned on this video, because next few videos are going to be some outtakes and fun stuff from going around the Sackville and our trip in Canada that I think might make you laugh a bit. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the series, and hope you enjoyed the rest of the videos that are going to be coming out this Christmas. And just thank you very much for watching. And please, a small note I'm adding in. For those who watch many videos will know there is a traditional family vet going on. And I need to get 10,000 subscribers in order for my mum to win it. So, please, if you do like the videos, share, subscribe, all those sort of things. I don't normally ask, but at Christmas, I do have the joy of this bet. Thank you very much, and now go laugh at basically the Canadian Naval History team being idiots. Including myself. Definitely myself. Most assuredly. It's alright. I would have been killed by a chief if he spotted me then.
But trainers are very different from boots, I swear. They have more things sticking out. And they tend to move things more.
Just stand there.
What with a 10-second countdown? How long does it take you to get your selfies? Push the button.
Go for the 3-second.
So, often we're asked what kind of changes do ships make to become museum ships. Well, there's a good example. There are bits which hang, which can be lethal. But in this space, there is, of course, this beam, for which there is de facto a crane system for helping with maintaining the triple expansion engines. Now, you're probably sitting there going, Alex, why does the beam end there? Well, the beam doesn't end there. The beam ends here. You can see where it goes in. You can see it goes right the way to that bulkhead there and all the way along. It would have gone side to side, but you and I, or judge, because, you know, we're coming around as viewers, can't dug our heads down that far to go through. Whereas sailors, they're just going to have to do it. So there you go. If you go around ships, especially museum ships, you will find bits of history like this, where the history has had to be adapted to provide access. And it's good it is, because it does provide access. It allows kids to get in here and look out over all this space and go, that's a really, really cool engine space. And it is. It's really cool. So, this is going to probably be a short and probably a YouTube, probably a Twitter video as well. So, this is a 40mm pom-pom mount. Now, there are many criticisms that I hear of the 40mm, and most of them are, in my mind, not really valid, because it's a weapon of its time. It's also a very good weapon. It's a very reliable weapon. And it basically, despite my young gun aimer here being not always the best on site, works by putting a lot of lead downrange. But this is your targeting system. Broadly speaking, one would call them iron sights and would consider that generous. Broadly speaking. So you're basically going, right then, there is an aerial target,
I'm roughly pointed in the right direction. I'm going to fill the space around it with as much lead as I can and hope something hits. But if it doesn't hit, it's probably going to make life sufficiently inhospitable for the person on the receiving end of it that they're going to decide they would prefer to be elsewhere. Preferably quickly, preferably rapidly, and preferably without bombing you in the meantime. Welcome to a triple expansion engine, and there aren't as many of these around in the world as there used to be. And this is the bits which make it all powerful, or rather which turn the power from steam and energy, which is basically heat and gas, semi-liquid in some sense, into, well, kinetic and movement. And this is it. This is the engine. This is the beating heart of Sackville. And even with one boiler, she would still have been able to keep going. And that's the other advantage of triple expansion. Triple expansion is incredibly resilient and works incredibly well under pressure. So yes, I did make it up to the radar position. It's cool. It is really cool. It's a great view around here. And yes, you know, most of you should not come up here. No one should, you know, there's signs which say don't come up, because it's not exactly safe. But again, if you know what you're doing, you're okay. If you know what you're doing. But this is a sneak peek to something which you'll be talking about. I will be talking about a lot later. Pom-pom position. Yeah. There it is aft. That is the beauty we're all really, really looking forward to seeing. And there's a full-length live I'll be posting a link to on this thread, which I hope you all enjoy, which was with Art, who's the chief of the boat, who's a fantastic guy. And this is Sackville. Today's Sackville Day.